is late, not the romantic kind of late, not candlelight late, but the hour where the world feels thinner, where sounds travel farther, and your thoughts stop asking for permission. Before you drift any deeper, if this quiet helps you feel safe tonight, you're welcome to stay with us. Subscribing softly keeps this place gentle and lets these nights continue. Now, rest. Somewhere in the dark, far from cities and screens, there is a shape standing in the desert that does not belong to night, does not belong to history, and certainly does not belong to comfort. You are not supposed to feel watched by a pile of stone, yet somehow you do. The longer you imagine it, the more unsettling it becomes, because it should not exist. And the fact that it does feels like an accusation. The Great Pyramid does not announce itself. It does not glow, hum, or whisper secrets. It simply stands there, quiet in a way that makes people nervous. For over 4,000 years, it has done nothing, and that is precisely the problem. Civilizations rise, collapse, rename themselves, forget their own gods, and the pyramid remains, unchanged, unimpressed, as if time were something that happens to other things. When modern people see it, they don't just see stone, they feel a strange pressure, the uncomfortable sense that someone long dead accomplished something we quietly assumed was beyond them and perhaps beyond us as well. So we react the way humans usually do when reality makes us uneasy. We invent better stories. Aliens are popular. Lost civilizations sound respectable. Forgotten technologies feel safe. Anything that keeps the answer comfortably distant. Because admitting that ordinary humans did this, humans without steel, electricity, engines, or screens, would mean admitting something far more disturbing, that human limitation is not as fixed as we like to believe. The pyramid is unsettling not because it is mysterious, but because it is clear, too clear, clear enough to suggest that effort, organization, and patience once outweighed convenience. Stand at its base and the scale feels almost impolite. The stones are not symbolic. They are aggressively real. Each block weighing more than a modern car, stacked with such confidence that the structure feels less like a building and more like a decision that could not be reversed. The angles rise with intention. The lines are calm and unforgiving, and somewhere deep inside, a quiet voice whispers that this was not luck, and it certainly was not chaos. It was planning. And planning at a level that makes modern group projects feel like performance art. The most uncomfortable detail is not how large the pyramid is, but how precise it is. Its alignment with true north is so accurate that engineers pause before explaining it, clearing their throats, choosing their words carefully. Today we use satellites to find north. They used shadows and stars. Today we have software to model stress loads. They had geometry and memory. The result is the same, except one method required more waiting, more repetition, and far fewer excuses. The sticks and shadows worked, and that realization lands harder than any conspiracy ever could. Precision implies intention, intention implies understanding, and understanding implies intelligence that we are not always willing to grant the past. It is easier to imagine help from the sky than discipline on the ground. Aliens require belief, patience requires accountability. When you strip away the myths, what remains is a deeply human story. People showing up every day to do something absurdly difficult, not because it was magical, but because it mattered to them, because their world made sense when it revolved around purpose rather than speed. The pyramid has watched humanity change its priorities. Once, building something that would last beyond a lifetime was considered honorable. Today, permanence makes us uncomfortable. We prefer updates, revisions, deletions, the ability to undo. The pyramid cannot be undone, and that makes it heavy in more ways than one. It does not apologize for existing. It does not explain itself. It does not care whether we understand it, and that indifference feels personal. There is a quiet irony in modern humans standing beneath this ancient structure, holding devices capable of accessing nearly all recorded knowledge, and still concluding that the answer must be extraterrestrial. It says very little about the pyramid and quite a lot about us. We admire innovation but distrust endurance. We celebrate speed but underestimate consistency. We love breakthroughs but quietly fear what sustained effort might reveal about our own potential. The pyramid is not a ruin in the usual sense. It does not crumble gracefully or blend into the background. It dominates the horizon like an unresolved thought. It is proof that ancient people were not improvising, not guessing, not blindly stacking stones and hoping for the best. They were methodical, organized, stubborn, in a way that modern culture finds exhausting just to imagine. And perhaps that is the deepest discomfort of all, that the pyramid was not built through brilliance alone, but through repetition, through days that looked exactly like the day before, through effort that never trended and never went viral. Nothing about its construction was fast. Nothing about it was convenient. It was built by people who woke up, worked, ate, slept, and repeated the process for years, possibly decades, trusting that the result would matter even if they never lived to see it finished. That is not mysterious. It is terrifying because it forces a comparison we did not ask for. So we soften the truth with fantasy. We talk about lost knowledge, divine intervention, cosmic visitors, anything that keeps the pyramid safely outside the category of human behavior. Because if humans once did this, then the limits we believe in now may not be limits at all. They may simply be habits that have not yet been challenged long enough to turn into stone. And the pyramid, ancient and patient, will continue to stand there in the dark, saying nothing, waiting for the next generation to look up, feel uncomfortable, and decide once again that someone else must have done the hard part for them. The obsession with impossible. The feeling lingers after you look away from the pyramid. It does not rush, it settles like dust after a long silence, and what remains is not awe but irritation, not at the structure itself, but at what it implies. Humans have always had a complicated relationship with the word impossible. We use it as both a shield and an excuse, a neat little fence we place around the edges of our confidence. Impossible means we are forgiven for not trying. It means failure was inevitable. It means the effort was never required in the first place. And yet, standing before the Great Pyramid, that word feels fragile, almost embarrassed to be spoken out loud, because the pyramid exists, and existence is the rudest rebuttal to impossibility imaginable. There is something deeply psychological about our discomfort here. The human brain loves limits, especially limits that feel external, gravity, time, resources, because limits mean we are not personally responsible for what we fail to achieve. When something crosses those limits without permission, it triggers a quiet defensive response. We begin to question not the object, but reality itself. Surely something else must have helped, something beyond us, something that allows our internal hierarchy to remain intact. The pyramid disrupts that hierarchy. It suggests that people without electricity, without steel, without algorithms, once executed a project so ambitious that even modern infrastructure would struggle to replicate it quickly. This is not flattering information. So the mind does what it does best. It reframes the problem until it feels manageable again. This is where the pyramid transforms, in the modern imagination, from a construction project into an insult. It becomes a stone reminder that technological progress does not automatically translate into human capability. We have machines that can lift entire buildings, software that can simulate structural stress down to the decimal, and global supply chains that move materials across oceans in days. And yet the thought of building something like the Great Pyramid today feels absurd. Not because it is physically impossible, but because it is organizationally exhausting. It would require decades of commitment, political stability, cultural alignment, and a shared belief that the project mattered enough to finish. Those are not engineering problems, they are human ones. And humans are notoriously unreliable when boredom enters the room. So we turn the pyramid into a joke, then into a mystery, then into a conspiracy. Aliens arrive on schedule, efficient, advanced, conveniently absent from the archaeological record. Lost civilizations make an appearance, vaguely defined but impressively skilled, erased by catastrophe, just in time to avoid uncomfortable follow-up questions. Forgotten technologies are mentioned, rarely explained, always just out of reach. These ideas spread not because they are convincing, but because they are comforting. They allow us to admire the pyramid without feeling challenged by it. They turn effort into fantasy and discipline into magic, which is far easier to digest at 2 a.m. Conspiracy culture thrives in these spaces, not because people are foolish, but because uncertainty paired with ego is a volatile combination. The idea that ancient humans were capable of extreme precision threatens a modern narrative we are very attached to. The story that we are the peak, the culmination, the smartest version of ourselves. If the past was capable of this, then progress is not a straight line upward, it is something messier, something cyclical, something that occasionally forgets what it already knew. That idea is unsettling, so it is easier to believe the past had help rather than competence. There is also a quieter, more personal discomfort at play. The pyramid represents time used differently. It represents patience as a strategy rather than a weakness. Modern culture celebrates speed, iteration, disruption, all words that imply motion without stillness. The pyramid required the opposite. It required people willing to repeat the same action thousands of times, correcting small errors, adjusting angles, aligning stones, knowing they would never see the final result completed. That kind of delayed gratification feels almost alien to us now, which is ironic because it is precisely what built the thing we call alien. So when modern observers scoff and say, humans could not have done this, what they often mean is, humans like us would not do this. We would lose interest, we would argue, we would defund it, we would redesign it halfway through, and then we would abandon it for something newer and shinier. The pyramid is not a failure of imagination, it is a failure of endurance. And endurance is not a trait currently trending. It does not photograph well, it does not go viral, and it does not reward you quickly. It simply accumulates. This is why the pyramid feels like a quiet insult to modern technology. Not because our tools are weak, but because our collective patience is. We have more capability than ever before, but less tolerance for long-term discomfort. The ancient builders had fewer options, fewer distractions, fewer exits. When they committed to something, they stayed, not because they were enlightened, but because leaving was not part of the plan. That reality clashes with our modern preference for flexibility and choice, which we celebrate as freedom, even when it quietly erodes our ability to finish what we start. The obsession with impossibility, then, is not about the pyramid at all. It is about protecting a fragile self-image. It is about preserving the belief that we are exceptional by default, rather than by effort. If the pyramid was built by aliens, then we remain unmatched. If it was built by a lost civilization, then we remain superior to the present, but inferior to a conveniently unreachable past. In both cases, we are spared the uncomfortable realization that the real difference between then and now might simply be commitment. Slowly, however, the emotional fog begins to thin. When the jokes wear off and the conspiracies lose their novelty, a quieter truth emerges. The pyramid does not demand belief, it invites examination. Not emotional examination, but practical, historical, deeply human analysis. When we shift from awe to curiosity, from defense to understanding, the story changes tone. It becomes less about impossibility and more about organization, less about mystery and more about method. This is the moment where discomfort gives way to clarity, where the question stops being who helped them and becomes how they did it. And that transition matters because it moves us away from fantasy and toward respect. Respect for systems, for labor, for planning, for a culture that decided something mattered enough to align thousands of lives toward a single goal. The pyramid does not hum with alien energy. It hums with human coordination. It is not a riddle left behind by gods. It is a record left behind by people who understood that impossibility is often just a temporary emotion. In the quiet of the night, when the jokes have faded and the desert feels closer than the screen, the pyramid stops being an insult and starts being a lesson. Not a comfortable one, but an honest one. That perhaps the most unsettling truth is not that ancient people were helped by something beyond humanity, but that they were fully human and they simply refused to stop. Who really built the pyramids? By the time the mind lets go of aliens and impossible machines, something else quietly takes their place, a far more familiar image, one that feels almost cinematic in its cruelty. Rows of half-naked slaves, backs bent under the sun, overseers with whips, suffering carved into every stone. It is an image so deeply ingrained that many people never question it. Hollywood taught us well. If something is ancient and large, someone must have been miserable building it. Preferably everyone. Preferably while dramatic music plays. The problem is this image is wrong. Not slightly wrong, not debatably wrong, but fundamentally and embarrassingly wrong. The pyramids were not built by enslaved masses beaten into submission. They were built by workers, organized workers, fed workers, paid workers. And that reality, strangely enough, is far more unsettling than the myth, because once you remove the chains and the whips, you are left with something harder to explain. People who chose to show up, people who returned day after day, people who worked within a system that expected coordination rather than terror. That is not as visually exciting as oppression, but it is infinitely more powerful. Archaeology has a habit of ruining good drama. When excavations around Giza uncovered worker settlements, the story shifted in ways popular culture never quite recovered from. These were not temporary camps or miserable hovels. They were planned villages, streets, barracks, kitchens, bakeries, breweries, medical facilities. This was not a slave pen. This was infrastructure, the kind you build when you expect people to stay a while. The workers were organized into rotating labor teams, often called gangs, which already sounds more rebellious than it actually was. These teams had names, and the names were carved into stone and written in records with a surprising amount of pride. Names like Friends of Khufu or Drunkards of Menkaure, which suggests two important things. First, these people had a sense of humor. Second, they were not anonymous. You do not name a gang of disposable slaves. You name a team you expect to function. They worked in shifts, often tied to the agricultural calendar. When the Nile flooded and farming paused, labor shifted to construction. This was not accidental. It was logistical brilliance. The state redirected idle manpower during flood seasons, providing food and shelter in exchange for labor. In modern terms, the pyramids were a massive public works project, less mystical ritual and more ancient economic policy. And yes, they were paid, not in gold or silver, but in the currency that mattered most in an ancient world: bread, beer, meat, shelter, medical care, survival. Workers received daily rations, calibrated for heavy labor, thick bread loaded with calories, beer that was more nutritious than intoxicating, meat on a scale that surprised archaeologists because starving people do not move multi-ton stones very well. This is where the myth truly collapses. Starving, beaten slaves do not produce precision architecture. They do not align structures to the stars. They do not maintain consistency across decades. They collapse. They revolt. Or they die. The pyramids required the opposite: a stable, motivated workforce capable of learning, adapting, and repeating complex tasks thousands of times. Even more telling is what happened when workers were injured. Evidence shows healed fractures, properly set bones, long-term recovery. You do not invest medical resources into disposable labor. You invest in assets, cold language perhaps, but accurate. The state needed these workers alive, functional, and returning to work. Compassion and pragmatism overlapped in a way that modern audiences rarely expect from ancient governments. Then there are the cemeteries, quiet, overlooked, and devastatingly honest. Workers were buried near the pyramids they helped build, often with grave goods, markers, and signs of respect. This was not the burial treatment of slaves. This was acknowledgement. These people mattered enough to be remembered close to the monument itself. Their bones carry the story their myths tried to erase. And this is where the narrative becomes deeply uncomfortable for modern sensibilities. The pyramids were not built through terror. They were built through organization, through bureaucracy, through a state apparatus that could feed tens of thousands of people daily and keep records precise enough to track labor, rations, and logistics. The pyramid was not a religious frenzy carried out by desperate masses. It was a planned project, executed over decades by a government that understood scale. That reality lacks romance, but it overflows with competence. It also reframes the pyramid entirely. This was not a magical offering to the gods constructed in a haze of incense and chanting. It was a state-sponsored construction project with religious purpose, yes, but also political necessity. The pyramid was a symbol of stability, power, and continuity. It told the population that the state could organize the land, the labor, and the future itself. In other words, the pyramid was propaganda. Stone propaganda. And it worked. For the workers, participation was not just labor, it was belonging. They were part of something larger than themselves, something visible from miles away. Their work would outlast them. That kind of legacy mattered deeply in a culture obsessed with the afterlife. Building the pyramid was not separate from religion, it was religion in practice. Order imposed on chaos, permanence carved into a shifting world. This is where the dry humor creeps in quietly and uninvited. Modern people often imagine ancient societies as either brutally oppressive or hopelessly mystical, as if bureaucracy was invented sometime after email. In reality, ancient Egypt ran on paperwork, planning, and accountability. The pyramids were not divine accidents. They were scheduled. Think about that for a moment. Somewhere 4,500 years ago, a scribe complained about deadlines. This understanding forces us to abandon another comforting myth, the idea that ancient people were driven by blind faith alone. Faith mattered, certainly, but faith without structure does not build mountains. What built the pyramids was administration, systems, the slow grinding machinery of organization that modern societies pretend to hate while depending on entirely. And perhaps that is why the slave myth persists. It allows us to distance ourselves emotionally. It lets us say, they suffered, therefore we could never do that. But if the builders were workers, fed and housed, and treated with a degree of respect, then the pyramid becomes something else entirely. It becomes a mirror reflecting what coordinated human effort can achieve when sustained long enough. That reflection is uncomfortable because it suggests that the difference between then and now is not intelligence, not technology, but alignment. The alignment of purpose, labor, and belief. Ancient Egypt had a centralized vision and the cultural patience to execute it. Modern societies have infinite visions and very little patience to finish any of them. The pyramid was not built by slaves praying for release. It was built by workers who complained, joked, ate, drank, got injured, healed, and returned to work. People who lived real lives. People who likely grumbled about supervisors and rations and sore backs. People who were human in the most ordinary way possible. And that is precisely what makes the pyramid extraordinary. It was not born from suffering alone. It was born from participation, from a society that for a time managed to synchronize thousands of individual lives toward a single goal. That synchronization is rare. It is fragile, and it is far harder to explain than a whip. The Hollywood image shatters under the weight of evidence, and what remains is quieter, heavier, and far more unsettling. The pyramids were not built by mythical forces or broken bodies. They were built by a functioning state and a workforce that endured, not because they were enslaved, but because they believed the work mattered. And once you accept that, the pyramid stops being a monument to oppression and becomes something far more dangerous to modern pride. A reminder that humans, when organized and committed, are capable of astonishing things without magic, without miracles, and without anyone from the stars lending a hand. That realization does not fade easily. It lingers, much like the pyramid itself. The most dangerous minds? Once the illusion of slaves collapses, another comforting belief quietly follows it into the dark. The idea that ancient builders were guessing, that they stacked stones until things somehow worked out, that trial and error, sprinkled with divine luck, carried the project forward. It is a reassuring thought, because guessing feels human, familiar, forgivable. Precision, on the other hand, feels threatening. Precision implies intention, and intention implies minds that knew exactly what they were doing. The architects of the pyramids were not guessing, not even close. They were calculating with a calm confidence that feels almost offensive when viewed from the present. These were not inspired amateurs chasing a dream. These were professionals operating within a system that valued measurement, repetition, and ruthless consistency. The pyramid did not rise because someone hoped it would work. It rose because someone measured, checked, corrected, and measured again. This is where the story shifts from physical labor to something far more dangerous: the minds behind the stones. Ancient Egyptian architects understood geometry not as theory, but as behavior. Angles were not abstract concepts, they were actions. A slope was not an idea, it was a commitment that had to be maintained across millions of stones. Deviate early, and the entire structure would betray you later. This was unforgiving mathematics, the kind that does not allow excuses. And yet, the pyramid holds its shape with terrifying loyalty to its original plan. The Great Pyramid's sides slope at roughly 51.8 degrees, a choice so precise that it still sparks debate. Too steep, and the structure collapses under its own weight. Too shallow, and it spreads, weakens, and fails to rise. That angle was not discovered accidentally. It was chosen, tested, trusted, and then repeated endlessly. But the angle is only the beginning. The pyramid is aligned almost perfectly to true north, not magnetic north, not approximate north, but the actual rotational axis of the planet. The margin of error is so small that even modern surveyors pause before commenting, because they know how difficult that alignment is with modern tools. And yet, here it is, carved into limestone, stubbornly accurate. No GPS, no satellites, no digital correction, just sky. The ancient Egyptians aligned their world by watching the stars, not romantically, not poetically, but clinically. They observed circumpolar stars, those that never set, rotating endlessly around the celestial north. By tracking their movement and bisecting their paths, they could determine true north with astonishing precision. This was not mysticism. It was astronomy, practiced patiently, night after night, until patterns revealed themselves. Imagine that for a moment, standing in the desert, night after night, watching stars move, recording their positions, correcting errors, waiting for clarity. No rush, no deadline notification, just time and attention. Two resources we pretend to value today while spending them as quickly as possible. During the day, the work continued with tools so simple they almost feel insulting. Rope, wooden stakes, water, shadows. A level surface created using water to find true horizontal, because water does not lie. Shadows cast by the sun to determine straight lines, because light is honest when observed carefully. A stretched rope to draw a line because tension behaves predictably. There is a quiet cruelty in how effective these methods are. We like to believe complexity requires complexity, that precision demands advanced technology. The pyramids suggest otherwise. They whisper that discipline and observation can outperform expensive tools when applied consistently. Compare that to the modern world where GPS can guide you within meters, yet people still miss their destination. Where digital maps constantly recalculate, and yet we feel lost the moment the signal drops. The ancient architects had no recalculation. If they were wrong, the pyramid would remember forever. This is where patience becomes the central character. Every measurement mattered because mistakes compounded. There was no option to patch later. The pyramid demanded accuracy from the first stone. That kind of pressure shapes a very specific kind of mind, a mind that double checks, that waits, that does not move forward until alignment is confirmed, a mind comfortable with delay in service of permanence. Modern culture would find these architects unbearable. They would ask too many questions. They would slow things down. They would insist on doing it again. They would reject good enough. And yet it is precisely this intolerance for approximation that allowed the pyramid to endure. There is something unsettling about realizing that ancient builders trusted natural constants more than modern humans trust machines. They trusted the movement of stars, the behavior of water, the reliability of shadows. They did not assume perfection, they observed it. And observation requires stillness. Stillness is dangerous in a world addicted to speed. The internal chambers of the pyramid reveal the same mindset. Weight distribution was carefully managed using relieving chambers designed to redirect massive loads away from critical spaces. These are not decorative choices, they are structural solutions to complex problems. Someone understood how stone behaves under pressure. Someone anticipated failure and designed around it. That someone did not leave their name behind, which is perhaps the most unsettling detail of all. We live in an era obsessed with authorship, credit, branding, legacy. The architects of the pyramids remained anonymous, their work speaking louder than any signature ever could. This was not ego-driven genius. This was institutional knowledge passed down, refined, and executed with discipline. No miracles, no divine intervention, no sudden inspiration, just systems. This is where the myth of ancient ignorance truly dies. These people were not waiting for gods to solve problems for them. They solved them themselves quietly, methodically, and without expecting applause. That level of competence is not romantic. It is threatening, because it suggests that human intelligence does not require modern packaging to be effective. It requires focus, continuity, a willingness to repeat what works and abandon what does not, skills that feel increasingly rare. The pyramid stands as evidence of what happens when knowledge is respected across generations, when techniques are refined rather than discarded, when patience is rewarded instead of mocked. The ancient Egyptians did not chase novelty. They chased reliability. That pursuit shaped minds capable of holding a vision steady for decades, minds comfortable with slow progress, minds that understood that greatness is not a moment, but an accumulation. There is dry humor hidden here if you listen closely. Modern observers armed with laser scanners and computer models still argue about how it was done, while the builders themselves would likely shrug and point to the sky, the ground, and the rope in their hands. Not because it was easy, but because it was clear. Clear does not mean simple. Clear means understood. The most dangerous thing about these minds was not their knowledge, but their restraint. They did not overcomplicate. They did not improvise unnecessarily. They trusted processes that worked, and they enforced discipline relentlessly. No magic, just a refusal to accept chaos. And perhaps that is why the pyramids feel so unsettling in the quiet hours of the night. They are monuments to control over materials, control over labor, control over time itself. They remind us that human beings, when they align observation with patience, can create things that make future civilizations deeply uncomfortable. The stones do not glow. The stars do not speak. The tools are unimpressive. And yet the result stands. Cold, precise, unapologetic, a reminder carved into the desert that miracles are often just discipline repeated until it becomes invisible. And that truth, more than any alien theory, is what keeps us awake. Cutting stone, a hell made of rock. Once the minds have done their work and the plans exist not as dreams but as lines on the ground, reality arrives with a very specific question: where exactly do millions of stones come from? And more importantly, who convinces the stones to cooperate? The answer is not elegant, not clever, and not remotely comfortable. It begins with limestone beneath the desert itself, quarried directly from the Giza Plateau, close enough to mock the workers with its availability, far enough to ensure every block still had to be earned. The limestone was soft compared to granite, which sounds comforting until you realize soft is relative. Soft still resists, still grinds teeth, still turns arms into trembling instruments of repetition. Quarries were cut by hand, not delicately, but insistently. Lines scored into the rock, wedges hammered in, stone separated from stone through force applied again and again, until the earth finally surrendered a block. And when it did not thank anyone for the effort. For the outer casing and bulk of the pyramid, limestone was everywhere, pale and blinding under the sun, reflecting heat upward until the air itself seemed tired. Dust-coated skin, eyes, lungs, settling into places it was never meant to be. There was no shade worth mentioning, no breeze worth hoping for, only the slow rhythm of labor. Strike, pause, strike again, the sound of stone meeting stone, echoing endlessly. This was not heroic work. It was not dramatic. It was not fast. It was an agreement between muscle and patience, an agreement that neither side could abandon without consequences. And then there was granite. Granite did not live nearby. Granite waited in Aswan, hundreds of kilometers to the south, as if daring anyone to come get it. Harder, darker, denser, heavier, granite was reserved for the inner chambers, the places that mattered most, the parts of the pyramid that would never be seen but would carry unimaginable weight. Choosing granite was not symbolic, it was practical. Granite could bear pressure that limestone could not. And someone knew this. Someone understood material behavior well enough to make that call, fully aware of the suffering it would require. Granite does not respond politely to tools. Copper chisels, often cited by skeptics with raised eyebrows, were not used to slice granite like butter. They were used to mark, score, and assist in a much slower process. The real work was done with dolerite, a stone used to break stone, dark, dense pounding tools that turned quarrying into an act of controlled violence. Dolerite balls were lifted and slammed repeatedly against granite surfaces, fracturing them slowly, painfully, one impact at a time. No sparks, no shortcuts, just impact followed by impact until the surface finally weakened enough to shape. Imagine the sound. A dull, heavy thud, again and again, hour after hour, day after day, the kind of sound that crawls into your skull and stays there even after sleep. Arms ache, hands blister, shoulders burn, and still the granite does not care. It waits. It forces the worker to match its indifference with persistence. This is where the concept of hell quietly enters the story, not as fire or punishment, but as repetition without variation. The same motion, the same resistance, the same outcome, delayed just long enough to test resolve. Cutting stone was not about strength alone, it was about enduring boredom sharpened into pain. The heat pressed down, the dust clung, sweat evaporated before it could cool anything, and the stone remained unmoved by complaints, unmoved by prayers, unmoved by curses muttered under breath. There is no cinematic version of this process that does it justice. No swelling music, no triumphant moment where the stone finally cracks in half and everyone cheers. When granite yields, it does so quietly, reluctantly, as if offended by the interruption. The worker does not celebrate because there is another block waiting and another after that. This was not a battle to be won, it was a condition to be endured. Transport would come later, but first the stone had to be freed, shaped roughly enough to move, and that shaping happened here in the quarries, under a sun that did not negotiate. The body adapts in small ways. Movements become efficient, muscles harden, pain dulls into background noise. This adaptation is not inspirational, it is survival, and it raises a dark, quiet question that probably crossed more than one mind during those endless hours. Will the afterlife at least be lighter than this block? The humor, if it exists at all, is bone dry and unspoken. There is something almost absurd about humans choosing to fight stone with stone, as if admitting defeat to metal and innovation and deciding brute persistence would have to be enough. It was enough eventually, but eventually is a long time when measured in heartbeats. The limestone quarries near Giza became scars in the landscape, cut deeper and deeper as demand continued. Each block removed was replaced by another empty space, a visible record of effort. The granite quarries at Aswan were even worse because distance added insult to injury. Every block cut there was only beginning its journey. Cutting was merely the opening act of suffering. The workers knew this. They were not ignorant of what came next. They understood that the block they had just wrestled from the earth would need to be dragged, loaded, floated, hauled, and lifted. And yet the cutting continued. Not because it was pleasant, but because stopping was not part of the system. The state needed stone, the pyramid demanded mass, and the stone did not care how tired anyone felt. This is where modern observers often flinch. It is easier to imagine lost technologies than to imagine this level of sustained physical effort. It is easier to invent machines than to accept that humans once committed to exhaustion as a long-term strategy. The reality is uncomfortable because it forces us to confront the limits of our own tolerance. We like to believe we could endure anything if necessary, but most of us struggle with mild inconvenience for extended periods. The ancient workers did not have that luxury. Their world was not optimized for comfort. It was optimized for continuity. You worked because work was how the system functioned. You endured because endurance was not optional. This was not cruelty for cruelty's sake. It was the cost of ambition in a world without alternatives. Stone cutting was the foundation of everything that followed. No ramps, no alignment, no architecture mattered without these blocks. First being freed from the earth. This was the invisible suffering beneath the visible monument, the quiet labor buried inside every stone. When you look at the pyramid, you do not see the hours, the blisters, the heat, the dust. You see smooth lines and confident geometry. The cost has been polished away. But it is there, embedded. Each block carries the memory of resistance, of impact, of a human body matching itself against geology and refusing to lose quickly. This is not a romantic story. It is a grinding one. And yet it is honest. The black humor surfaces again, faint but persistent. One can almost imagine workers joking under their breath, asking whether the gods had ever tried lifting granite in this heat, wondering if the afterlife came with lighter materials, hoping that eternity involved less repetition. Humor, after all, is often the last defense against monotony. Cutting stone was not glorious. It was necessary. It was the price paid before anything impressive could even begin. The pyramid was born not from inspiration, but from exhaustion, repeated until progress appeared. That truth lingers uncomfortably because it suggests that greatness often begins in places we would rather avoid, in work so dull and punishing that it rarely earns admiration. And yet, without this hell made of rock, nothing else would exist. No precision, no alignment, no legacy, just uncut stone, resting comfortably in the earth, never knowing it could become something that would outlast civilizations. The workers did not conquer the stone, they outlasted it. And in the quiet hours of the night, when the desert cools and the pyramid looms in memory, that distinction matters more than we like to admit. Dragging a mountain across the desert. Once the stone has been cut, bruised, and persuaded to leave the earth, another problem emerges quietly, and without mercy, the stone is still not where it needs to be. It lies there, heavy and indifferent, as if daring anyone to explain the next step. This is the moment where imagination often fails, because moving stone is less glamorous than cutting it, and far more revealing. You cannot pretend this part was mystical, because movement exposes effort, coordination, noise, and fatigue in a way no myth can fully conceal. The solution was not wheels, not machines, not clever tricks lost to time. It was sledges, wooden sledges, thick ropes, sand and water. That is it. No upgrades, no hidden mechanism waiting to be rediscovered. Just friction, reduced slightly, negotiated patiently, defeated slowly. The stones were placed on sledges, heavy wooden frames designed to distribute weight just enough to prevent immediate failure. Ropes were tied, many ropes, thick, rough, biting into hands that were already familiar with pain. The sand beneath was not left dry because dry sand resists, it grips, it punishes. Someone noticed that wet sand behaves differently, that it compacts, that it allows the sledge to glide rather than dig in. This observation alone reduced the required force dramatically, not through innovation but through attention. Again, nothing magical. Just noticing how the world behaves when you watch it closely. Water was poured deliberately in front of the sledge, not too much, not too little, because excess creates mud and mud betrays you. This was controlled wetness, managed by people who understood balance intuitively. Then came the pulling. This was not a silent operation. It could not be. Dozens of people lined up along the ropes, bodies angled forward, feet digging into sand that shifted and slid despite every effort. Someone called the rhythm. Someone always did. A shout, a chant, a beat that turned chaos into synchronization. Pull, pause, pull, breathe, pull again. The stone did not respond to enthusiasm. It responded to timing. Individual strength meant nothing here. This was not a test of heroes. No single person could move the block, even an inch alone. The stone demanded consensus. Every pull had to happen together, or the effort dissolved into wasted motion. If one person slipped, others compensated. If the rhythm broke, progress stalled. This was collective labor in its purest form, anonymous and unforgiving. There is something unsettling about how effective this was. We are conditioned to believe progress requires innovation, that the old ways must be inefficient by definition. And yet these sledges moved stones weighing several tons across sand using methods that modern physics textbooks quietly confirm as sound. The math agrees. The desert does not argue. The workers shouted not to motivate but to align. Sound became a tool just as essential as rope or water. The chant was not emotional, it was functional. It told bodies when to strain and when to rest, when to dig in and when to breathe. Without it, the pull would fragment into noise and exhaustion. This is where the myth of individual greatness dissolves completely. There is no space for personal triumph in this process. No dramatic camera angle, no chosen one. Just a line of people pulling until their muscles learned the rhythm better than their minds. This was not about proving strength. It was about surrendering ego. The pyramid in this sense is not the achievement of a genius or a king alone. It is the physical record of thousands of people agreeing, day after day, to pull at the same time. A nation, quite literally, moving in one direction. Modern culture struggles with this idea. We celebrate the individual, the disruptor, the visionary. The pyramid celebrates none of that. It celebrates coordination, obedience to rhythm, trust in the group. The stone does not care who you are. It only moves when everyone pulls together. As the blocks traveled from quarry to construction site, the desert became a corridor of effort. Tracks worn into sand, footprints erased and reappearing endlessly. Water carriers moving alongside, careful not to spill too much, careful not to spill too little. Supervisors watching alignment, not to punish but to preserve efficiency. If the sledge veered, the correction happened immediately because delay multiplied effort later. This was not cruelty, it was optimization. And yet the cost was real. Shoulders burned, hands split, feet blistered. The sun pressed down with the same indifference it had shown at the quarries. The stone did not get lighter. The distance did not shrink out of kindness. progress was measured in meters, sometimes less. But it was measurable, and that mattered. There is a quiet, dark humor in imagining modern humans attempting this. The planning meetings alone would last months. Safety regulations would multiply. Arguments would erupt over credit and compensation and timelines. Someone would suggest outsourcing. Someone would quit halfway through. The stone would remain exactly where it was. The ancient workers did not have that luxury. The system moved forward because stopping was not rewarded. The rhythm continued because it had to. This was not blind obedience, it was survival within structure. Everyone pulled because everyone needed the project to succeed, economically, socially, spiritually. As the blocks reached the construction site, the work did not end, it transformed. The sledges arrived at the base of something growing slowly skyward, a shape that demanded more stone, always more. The sight of it must have been equal parts motivating and exhausting. Every block delivered meant the pyramid was larger and therefore hungrier. The phrase national project feels abstract until you imagine this moment. Thousands of individuals contributing fragments of effort to something none of them could complete alone. No single worker would live to see the pyramid finished. That knowledge did not stop them. It contextualized them. The pyramid was not built by heroes. It was built by systems that made heroism unnecessary. The strength was in the repetition, in the predictability, in the understanding that progress was cumulative. Each pull mattered because it was part of a pattern, not because it was exceptional. This is why the pyramid feels so alien to modern sensibilities. It is not optimized for recognition. It does not reward individuality. It does not care who pulled hardest. It only records that pulling happened. The desert, too, played its role. Sand erased mistakes quickly. Wind covered tracks. Only the stone remembered? When the block reached its destination, when it was placed and leveled and adjusted, the journey vanished behind it. All that effort compressed into stillness. There is something haunting about that. Thousands of voices reduced to silence. Thousands of movements frozen into geometry. The pyramid does not show strain. It hides it. It absorbs it. In the late-night quiet, this realization settles heavily. The pyramid is not just a monument to the dead or a symbol of power. It is the fossilized rhythm of a society moving together, a nation pulling in unison, not metaphorically but physically, their combined effort translated into stone. And perhaps that is why it endures, not because it was built by exceptional individuals, but because it was built by ordinary people doing something extraordinary together. That kind of unity is rare, fragile, and deeply unsettling to a world that prefers to pull in every direction at once. The pyramid stands because, for a time, no one did that. They pulled together. Lifting stone without learning to fly. Once the stone reached the base, once the desert had surrendered it and the nation had dragged it into position, the question did not disappear, it sharpened. The block was no longer just heavy, it was inconveniently heavy because now it needed to go up. Not metaphorically, physically, higher than any sensible structure had any right to be. This is the moment where myths usually take over, where imagination panics and invents shortcuts, levitation, lost machines, divine intervention with excellent upper body strength. But the truth, as always, is quieter and far more disturbing. The Egyptians did not make the stone fly. They persuaded it to climb. The primary weapon was the ramp, an idea so brutally simple that it feels insulting to anyone hoping for mystery. A slope. Dirt, rubble, limestone chips, packed tightly, rebuilt constantly. Gravity was not defeated, it was negotiated with. The stone was not lifted into the sky, it was dragged upward at an angle so gentle that physics reluctantly allowed it. There were straight ramps first, long and stubborn, extending from the ground directly up the face of the pyramid. These worked beautifully at the beginning, when the pyramid was still low and optimism was cheap. But as the structure grew, the ramp had to grow longer, and longer ramps require more material than the pyramid itself, which is a strong hint that this method had limits. At a certain point, the ramp became an absurd project of its own, a second monument devoted entirely to the act of moving stone. So the ramps adapted, because the Egyptians adapted, constantly, without ceremony. Zigzag ramps appeared, wrapping back and forth along the sides of the pyramid, reducing length while increasing complexity. These ramps clung to the structure like scaffolding made of patience, forcing workers to navigate corners, adjust rhythm, and pull stone sideways before pulling it upward again. Progress slowed, coordination became more demanding, mistakes became more expensive. Then there were spiral ramps, possibly internal, possibly external, curling around the pyramid's body like a secret artery. These ramps allowed stone to move upward without obscuring the pyramid's faces entirely, a detail that matters when precision is your religion. The workers likely did not care about architectural debates. They cared that the ramp worked, that the stone moved, that today's effort was not undone tomorrow. None of these ramps were permanent. They were built, used, dismantled, rebuilt, reshaped. The pyramid rose as the ramps vanished behind it, erasing the evidence of the struggle. The final structure appears clean, composed, effortless, which is perhaps the cruelest illusion of all. Dragging a block up a ramp did not end the labor. It intensified it. The higher the stone climbed, the more precise everything had to become. A slip near the top was not just embarrassing, it was catastrophic. The chant grew sharper. The pulls became shorter, more controlled. The stone resisted with renewed enthusiasm, as if offended by the altitude. And then came the lever. The lever is not glamorous. It does not glow. It does not inspire conspiracy theories. It is a piece of wood, a beam, a fulcrum, and yet it might be the most important tool in the entire project. With it, workers could lift a stone a few centimeters at a time, just enough to slide packing material beneath, just enough to raise it incrementally toward its final position. Lift, wedge, lift, wedge, again, and again, and again. There is something deeply unsettling about how effective this was. No explosion of effort, no dramatic moment, just repetition, each movement almost meaningless on its own, yet unstoppable in accumulation. The stone rose, not because someone was strong, but because someone was patient enough to repeat the same motion hundreds of times without losing count. This process was applied millions of times. Millions. Each block requiring countless small adjustments, each adjustment demanding attention. One careless lift could tilt the block, compromise alignment, force hours of correction. So the workers moved slowly, painfully slowly. Precision was not optional, it was survival. Modern minds struggle with this kind of monotony. We associate progress with novelty, with change, with constant stimulation. The pyramid was built on sameness, days that felt identical, movements that never evolved, muscles that memorized effort so completely that thought became unnecessary. This is not the kind of work that produces legends. It produces calluses. Imagine the soundscape: wood creaking, stone scraping, breathing, commands spoken without urgency because urgency wastes energy. No music, no speeches, just the relentless rhythm of labor. The sun does not care how high you have climbed. It burns the same at every level. As the pyramid grew taller, the air changed. Wind picked up. Balance mattered more. A dropped tool could vanish into distance, lost forever. Fear was present, but not theatrical. It was practical. Fear sharpened focus. Fear reminded everyone that gravity was still waiting. The stone once placed did not always cooperate. Sometimes it sat wrong. Sometimes it leaned. Sometimes it disagreed. When that happened, the response was not anger or awe. It was adjustment. Levers again. Wedges again. Tiny corrections repeated until the block surrendered. No shortcuts. No good enough. Because good enough does not stack. The monotony here is the true horror. Not pain, not heat, but the endless repetition of effort with no visible reward until much later. The pyramid did not reveal itself gradually in a satisfying way. It remained incomplete for decades. A massive, unfinished thing that demanded more stone every day. This is why conspiracy theories feel comforting. They replace monotony with spectacle. They turn boredom into brilliance. They allow us to imagine a single moment where everything clicked, where technology or magic intervened and spared humans from tedium. The truth is worse, and therefore more impressive. The truth is that humans endured the boredom. They repeated tasks not because they were inspired, but because repetition was the only path forward. They trusted the process because there was no alternative. The pyramid did not care about motivation. It responded only to consistency. Every stone lifted without flight is a reminder of this discipline. No moment in the pyramid's construction was dramatic enough to stand alone. The drama is in the accumulation, in the sheer volume of unremarkable actions stacked into permanence. By the time the pyramid reached its upper levels, the ramps narrowed, the space tightened, and the labor intensified. Fewer people could work at once. Each block required more time. Progress slowed. The temptation to rush must have been enormous. They did not. That restraint is the quiet triumph here. The final stones near the apex demanded the same process as the first. Lift, wedge, adjust, align. Gravity was never cheated. It was respected. The pyramid rose because no one tried to outsmart physics. They worked within it until it bent, slightly, patiently, in their favor. When the ramps were finally removed, when the last stone settled into place, the structure did not advertise its struggle. It stood calm, silent, as if it had always been there. The labor vanished from sight, preserved only in alignment and mass. That is perhaps the most unsettling part. The pyramid looks effortless because effort has been erased. All that remains is outcome, a mountain of stone pretending it assembled itself. But at night, when the desert cools and the mind wanders, you can almost hear it, the creak of wood, The scrape of stone, the rhythm of voices counting time, millions of repetitions compressed into silence. The stone did not fly. It climbed, slowly, relentlessly, one small movement at a time. Bread, beer, and the business of staying alive. By the time the stone learned how to climb, another truth had already settled deep into the project. No one builds a pyramid on empty stomachs. Geometry does not function without calories. Precision collapses without rest. Even discipline, that quiet god of the construction site, demands to be fed. And so, beneath the ramps and behind the levers, there was another system at work, less visible, less romantic, but just as essential. The logistics of survival. The pyramids were not built by starving men hallucinating grandeur in the heat. That image belongs to movies, not reality. Ancient Egypt understood something painfully simple. If you want people to pull mountains, you must first keep them alive. Ideally, fed. Preferably, hydrated. And occasionally, convinced that tomorrow is worth showing up for. The backbone of this effort was bread, heavy, dense, dark loaves that bore little resemblance to anything found in modern bakeries. This was not artisanal, this was functional. Bread as fuel, bread as currency, bread as survival compressed into chewable form. These loaves were thick enough to double as building materials in an emergency, though thankfully that idea never caught on. Workers consumed staggering amounts of it, enough to power bodies burning thousands of calories a day. Pulling stone is not subtle exercise. It consumes everything. The bread delivered carbohydrates in brutal efficiency, filling stomachs and slowing hunger just long enough to make the next pull possible. Alongside bread came onions, dates, legumes, fish when available, and occasionally meat. Not luxury, but balance. Salt mattered. Fat mattered. The diet was repetitive but deliberate. Ancient administrators understood nutrition long before the word existed. You cannot chant in rhythm if you collapse halfway through the rope. And then there was beer. Not the kind that invites conversation or pretends to taste like citrus. Egyptian beer was thick, cloudy, and closer to liquid bread than anything you would willingly order today. It was brewed from barley and emmer wheat, lightly fermented, low in alcohol, high in nutrients, a drink you could almost chew. Each worker received up to 4 liters per day. 4 liters. This was not indulgence, it was hydration and sustenance combined. Clean water was unreliable, beer was safer, fermentation killed pathogens. The mild alcohol numbed aches just enough to keep morale from collapsing entirely. This was not drinking on the job. This was the job. The beer did not taste good. Contemporary descriptions, reconstructed recipes, and modern experiments all agree on this. It was sour, gritty, filling, and deeply unremarkable. But it worked. It kept muscles moving. It kept dehydration at bay. It softened the edges of exhaustion without dulling coordination. In a quiet, almost poetic way, the pyramids were built on carbs. Wheat, barley, yeast, and water transformed into motion through human effort. Stone rises because bread exists. Geometry stands because beer flows. The infrastructure behind this was immense. Bakeries operated constantly, producing tens of thousands of loaves daily. Breweries bubbled and steamed. Butchers processed cattle and sheep at a scale that leaves behind archaeological evidence, unmistakable in its volume. Bones do not lie. These people were fed. This does not mean life was comfortable. It means it was structured. Workers lived in organized villages near the construction site. Not tents, not shacks, but planned settlements with streets, storage rooms, sleeping quarters. There were kitchens. There were medical areas. Archaeologists have found evidence of treated injuries, healed fractures, amputations that patients survived. A society does not invest in medical care for disposable labor. People rested, people slept, people returned the next day. The work was seasonal for many. Farmers joined during the Nile flood when fields were submerged and agricultural labor paused. The pyramid absorbed surplus manpower and returned wages in food, security, and status. Participation mattered. Being part of the project meant being part of the state. This is where modern assumptions break down. We imagine suffering as constant because we imagine exploitation as total. The reality was harsher and kinder at the same time. The work was exhausting. The heat was unforgiving. The repetition was soul-flattening. But the system sustained itself because it had to. A starving workforce is not an obedient workforce. It is a collapsing one. There is a dark humor in realizing that one of humanity's greatest monuments depended so heavily on beer. Not divine fire, not alien technology, fermented grain, 4 liters a day, enough to make even the most dedicated modern productivity expert deeply uncomfortable. And yet it worked. The workers were not miserable caricatures. They joked, they complained, they named their work gangs with pride and sarcasm. Names like Friends of Khufu or Drunkards of Menkaure appear in records, equal parts loyalty and irony. This was not blind devotion. This was participation with personality intact. Food anchored that humanity. Shared meals create rhythm. Rations mark time. Beer, at the end of the day, signals survival achieved, at least for now. The pyramid rose not just because stones moved, but because people kept returning. It is tempting to romanticize this, to imagine a noble workforce united in purpose, singing under the stars, content in their contribution to eternity. That would be dishonest. Bodies hurt. Tempers flared. Accidents happened. People died. The cemeteries prove that. But those cemeteries are also proof of care, of burial near the monument, of remembrance. The system did not pretend the work was easy. It made it survivable. This is the uncomfortable middle ground history rarely shows us. Not misery porn, not heroic fantasy, just labor sustained by calories and organization. The pyramid is not a miracle of suffering. It is a miracle of logistics. At night, when the desert cooled and the beer settled heavy in stomachs, workers slept, knowing tomorrow would be identical. Bread, beer, stone, pull, lift, adjust, repeat. The monotony was broken only by injury, promotion, or the slow, almost imperceptible growth of the structure itself. And that growth mattered. It gave context to exhaustion. Each loaf consumed, each mug drained, was converted into permanence. The pyramid is not just stone, it is stored energy. Millions of meals turned into geometry. Modern society likes to separate mind and body, planning and execution. Ancient Egypt did not have that luxury. They fed the body so the plan could exist. They respected the equation between fuel and outcome. Without bread, the pyramid stops. Without beer, the chants fall apart. Life was not easy, but it was maintained. And in that maintenance, in that relentless attention to basic needs, lies another quiet truth that unsettles modern sensibilities. Great achievements are not sustained by inspiration alone. They are sustained by systems that make showing up possible. The pyramid did not rise on dreams. It rose on bread. It stood on beer. And it endured because, day after day, someone made sure the workers lived long enough to pull again. When the night runs out of questions. When the night grows thin and the desert finally cools, the pyramid does something strange. It stops asking to be explained. It stands there, calm, massive, uninterested in our conclusions. By this point, the mystery has already dissolved, not because it was solved, but because it was never what we thought it was. The pyramid is not a riddle waiting for brilliance. It is a mirror waiting for honesty. We keep circling it with theories because theories protect us. They soften the impact. They allow distance, aliens, lost civilizations, forgotten machines. These ideas are not about the past. They are about us. They are ways of saying people like us could not have done this, without admitting what that really means. Because if ordinary humans, with limited tools and aching bodies, built something this precise, this enduring, then the uncomfortable question shifts direction. Not how they did it, but why we doubt ourselves so easily. The truth, stripped of spectacle, is deeply unsettling. The pyramids were built by people who believed effort mattered even when reward was delayed beyond their lifetime. People who trusted systems more than inspiration. People who repeated the same actions until repetition became mastery. There was no moment where everything suddenly became easy. No final breakthrough that erased decades of strain. Just continuity. They believed that tomorrow would come, and that their work would still matter when it did. This belief is subtle. It does not announce itself. It does not trend. It is not dramatic enough for documentaries that need crescendos. And yet it is the most radical idea in the entire story. The idea that persistence, not genius, shapes the world. We live surrounded by tools the pyramid builders could not imagine. Machines that lift tons effortlessly. Software that calculates angles instantly. Communication that crosses continents in seconds. And yet, standing before the pyramid, many of us feel smaller, not greater. Not because we lack capability, but because we lack patience. Our age excels at beginnings. We are brilliant at prototypes, concepts, announcements. We love the first stone. We struggle with the millionth repetition. The pyramid does not care about beginnings. It is a monument to follow through. This is why it feels accusatory without saying a word. The ancient builders did not know how the story would end. They did not have hindsight to reassure them. They worked inside uncertainty, trusting process instead of outcome. Their faith was not mystical. It was procedural. Show up, pull, eat, sleep, repeat. No applause, no guarantee. Just discipline. We prefer to imagine that they were driven by divine fear or royal coercion, because that makes their endurance feel unreachable. But the archaeological record disagrees. These were people with names, with jokes scratched into stone, with injuries healed by care, with meals planned and distributed. They complained, they rested, they returned. They did not work because they were superhuman. They worked because they were organized. And that may be the most unsettling conclusion of all. The pyramid does not celebrate transcendence. It celebrates consistency. It is not a symbol of mystery. It is a symbol of agreement. Thousands of people aligning their efforts across time, accepting monotony as the price of permanence. That kind of unity feels alien now. We distrust it. We fear it. We associate it with loss of individuality. And yet individuality alone never built anything this large. At night, when explanations lose their sharp edges, this realization lingers. The pyramid does not judge us. It simply exists as evidence. Evidence that human potential expands not when we wait for inspiration, but when we commit to rhythm. We often ask what secret knowledge was lost. Perhaps the secret was not knowledge at all. Perhaps it was tolerance for boredom. Perhaps it was the ability to invest effort into something that would not love you back immediately. The pyramid never thanked its builders. It never acknowledged their pain. It absorbed it and stood still. That is hard to accept because we want meaning to be reciprocal. We want effort to be rewarded visibly. We want progress to reassure us along the way. The pyramid offers none of that comfort. It offers silence, and silence forces reflection. As the night thins further, one final thought emerges, uncomfortable and persistent. The ancient world did not lack intelligence. It lacked distraction. There were no notifications pulling attention away from repetition. No constant recalibration of identity. Just work, sustained long enough to become legacy. We have replaced endurance with acceleration and acceleration with anxiety. We move faster than ever, yet often feel as though we arrive nowhere. The pyramid arrived. It arrived slowly. It arrived without asking permission. And it stayed. There is no need to romanticize the past to learn from it. The pyramid does not ask for admiration. It asks for comparison, not between tools, but between values, not between technology, but between time horizons. They thought in generations. We think in updates. Neither is inherently wrong, but only one leaves behind mountains. As dawn approaches, the desert begins to stir. Light creeps across stone that has seen thousands of mornings, just like this one. The pyramid remains unmoved, unbothered, complete in its indifference. It does not care if we finally understand it. It only asks one quiet question. Long after the documentaries end and the theories fade, if they could do this patiently together, without certainty of reward, what exactly are we waiting for? The night does not answer. It simply ends and leaves you there, thinking